After buying a house, the man hoped for a new peaceful life. But soon, strange sounds began to come from under the driveway. At first, he thought it was just old concrete. But when the slabs began to collapse and he decided to dig up the ground, he made a discovery that shocked not only him, but the entire city. Subscribe and write where you're watching this video from. Michael Harper had always believed that life, no matter how heavy and monotonous it could feel, was a journey meant to be redirected if one had the courage to act. At 42, he was tired of the city's rhythm, the endless honking of horns, the suffocating air that carried the smell of exhaust fumes, and the way days blurred together in an unbroken chain of noise and fatigue. For years he had risen before dawn, cleaned his hands of oil and grease, and walked into the auto shop where he had built a modest reputation as a reliable mechanic. His hands were strong, his back firm, but his spirit felt increasingly worn down. The shop had become a cage, the apartment he lived in no more than a box where he collapsed each night. He needed change. He needed silence, or at least a place where silence could breathe around him. The chance came almost by accident. He had spent weeks scrolling through listings, most far beyond what his savings could reach. One evening, sitting at the small kitchen table of his apartment with a chipped mug of coffee, he came across a posting. An old two-story house in a quiet suburb outside the city offered for a price that seemed almost unbelievable. The photos showed peeling paint, cracked pavement, a garden overrun with weeds, but there was something in those images that spoke to him. He saw possibility where others might see decay. More than that, he saw escape. The seller was an older man, gray-haired and impatient, who avoided prolonged conversation. When Michael visited for the first time, the man shuffled papers quickly, eager to conclude the meeting. He insisted on a fast transaction, his eyes darting away whenever questions about the property's past arose. Michael, too eager to seize his chance, ignored the unease that should have lingered. Perhaps, he told himself, the man was simply weary, desperate to move elsewhere. Perhaps there was no story at all, only an old house waiting for someone new to bring life back into it. The house itself stood with a weary dignity, a rectangular silhouette of faded brick and weathered wood. Its roof slanted in a tired way. Its shutters hung uneven, yet in Michael's eyes it carried character. He imagined repainting the walls, clearing the yard, repairing the driveway. More importantly, he imagined mornings without traffic, nights filled not with shouting neighbors, but with the whisper of wind through trees. When he signed the papers and clutched the keys in his hand, he felt the weight of the city begin to slip from his shoulders. For the first time in years, he thought of the word home and believed it could belong to him. The first days after moving in were filled with the clatter of boxes and the smell of dust shaken free from old rooms. Michael worked from sunrise to dusk, scrubbing, hammering, hauling. Sweat rolled down his arms, but with every nail driven and every box unpacked, he felt a quiet pride. In the evenings, he sat on the porch, the air cooler now, watching the light sink across the garden. There was a peace in those moments he had not known in decades. And yet, beneath the peace, something else lingered. It began with the driveway. The pavement bore cracks like veins running across its surface, not unusual for an old property, but somehow deeper than expected. Michael noticed them each morning when he backed his truck out, the tires rolling over uneven stones. He promised himself that one day soon he would resurface the drive, though the task was not urgent. At night, as he lay in bed in the still, unfamiliar bedroom, he sometimes thought he heard something, a faint shifting, a muted sound carried through the floor and into his bones. It was the kind of noise one could almost dismiss as imagination, the groaning of old wood, the distant movement of earth. He tried to tell himself it was nothing, that old houses had voices, and this was simply one of them. Still, the sounds returned. Some nights, when the silence pressed in, he would hold his breath and listen, waiting. The noise was soft, like gravel brushing against metal, a dull scrape that came and went without pattern. Once, unable to resist his curiosity, he rose from bed, padded to the window, and peered into the darkness. The garden lay still, the driveway stretched silent, the shadows motionless. Nothing moved. Yet, even after he returned to bed, he felt the echo of that sound in his chest, like a faint warning that he could not name. Michael was not a man easily swayed by superstition. His life had been built on practical things, bolts and engines, grease and steel. But there was something unsettling about the way the driveway seemed to carry a secret of its own. He remembered how the seller had rushed the paperwork, how his hands had trembled as he signed. He remembered how the man avoided eye contact when Michael asked about the property's history. Perhaps it was nothing. Perhaps the old man had simply been eager to move to warmer climates, to escape loneliness, or to shed responsibility. Yet perhaps there was something more. Despite the unease, Michael pushed forward with his new life. He rose each morning, drove to the shop, and returned in the evening to chip away at small repairs around the house. He replaced window frames, cleared weeds from the garden, tightened loose railings. Each improvement was a declaration. This is mine now. This is my place. And yet, each time he walked across the driveway, he felt the unevenness beneath his boots, saw the cracks stretching a little further, and wondered how deep they went. The nights continued to whisper. Some were quiet, others filled with that faint scrape that made him pause. He tried to dismiss it, reminding himself that houses always held quirks, that earth shifted naturally with time. Still, a small knot of tension began to grow inside him. He did not share his unease with anyone. Not the co-workers who asked how the new place was, not the neighbors who waved politely as he passed. It was easier to keep it inside, easier to smile and speak of peace and space, easier to pretend that the house was nothing more than a house. One evening, sitting on the porch as dusk painted the horizon, Michael tried to let the quiet settle over him. He watched the trees sway gently, the air warm on his skin. Yet, when he glanced at the driveway, at the cracked stones and faint depressions, he felt a chill stir through his chest. The city had followed him here in a different shape, not through noise and smoke, but through silence heavy with secrets. He wondered then if his life had truly changed, or if change always carried its own shadows. What Michael could not know was that the whispers beneath his feet were not simply the groans of an old structure, nor the shifting of tired soil. The house he had bought so eagerly had roots deeper than he imagined. And soon, the driveway that he crossed so casually each day would betray its secret. The silence he longed for would break, replaced by a truth that waited patiently beneath the surface. That truth stirred even now, in the darkness below, as if listening to the weight of his steps and the rhythm of his life. Michael believed he had found peace, but the house had been waiting for him all along. The days in Michael's new home settled into a rhythm, though it was a rhythm with an undercurrent of unease he couldn't shake. The house was old but solid, the kind that carried its own dignity even in weariness. He grew accustomed to the sounds of the floorboards, the whispers of the wind through the neglected garden, and even the creaks of the roof at night. Yet there was always something about the driveway that pulled his attention back again and again. The cracks that spiderwebbed across its surface seemed to deepen, and every time he drove across them, he felt a faint jolt as though the ground shifted ever so slightly under the weight of his truck. One particular morning, just as dawn was breaking, Michael prepared for work as usual. The light was pale, casting the house and yard in shades of gray-blue, and the air still carried the chill of night. He climbed into his old truck, tossed his thermos onto the passenger seat, and turned the ignition. The engine came alive with its familiar growl, a sound that usually brought him comfort, a reminder that some things remained reliable. But as he shifted into reverse and pressed on the gas, the truck did not glide backward as it always had. Instead, it lurched forward awkwardly, the rear tires refusing to release from the grip of the ground. Michael frowned, shifted gears again, and tried once more. This time, there was a jarring resistance, followed by the unsettling sensation of the rear wheel dropping. The truck tilted just enough to make his stomach flip. He slammed on the brakes and killed the engine, heart pounding as the realization struck him that the driveway itself was failing. He climbed out quickly, boots crunching on the gravel, and rounded the back of the truck. His breath caught when he saw what had happened. One of the concrete pavers beneath the rear tire had collapsed into a shallow depression. It was as though the ground had simply given way. The wheel had sunk several inches down, caught awkwardly in a hollow that had not existed the night before. He muttered under his breath, a mix of irritation and alarm, then crouched to get a closer look. His fingers brushed over the jagged edges of the broken paver, and he could see that the earth beneath was not compact and firm as it should have been, but loose as though disturbed. The morning quiet seemed heavier then, broken only by the faint rustle of leaves in the garden. He leaned closer, peering into the gap where the paver had fallen. At first, it was only shadow, dark and nondescript, but then something caught his eye, a flicker of light reflecting off metal. It was faint, rust-colored, but undeniably there. He froze, his breath locked in his throat. It wasn't a stone, it wasn't root or soil, it was man-made. Something metallic lay hidden just beneath the surface of his driveway. The sight of it stirred a strange mixture of emotions in him. Logic told him it could be nothing more than an old pipe, perhaps part of a forgotten utility line or debris from when the house had first been built. But another part of him, deeper and more instinctual, whispered that this was not ordinary. This was something placed, something buried. He felt the scrape of that noise he had heard in the nights replaying in his mind, as though it had all been leading to this moment. His first impulse was to test the object with his hands. He set his tools aside and dug at the dirt with his fingers, brushing soil away until more of the surface was exposed. The metal was rough, pitted with rust, and seemed to be part of a larger structure rather than a simple scrap. He pressed against it, trying to move it, but it would not budge. He fetched a small pry bar from the back of his truck and tried again, but the earth held it tightly. No matter how he angled or strained, the object resisted. Michael sat back on his heels, wiping the dirt from his hands onto his jeans, and exhaled slowly. He could feel his heart beating faster than it should have for such a simple discovery. It wasn't just the stubbornness of the object that unnerved him, it was the fact that it was there at all. Why would a piece of metal be hidden beneath the driveway of a suburban home? Why had the earth around it been so loose, as though filled in deliberately? The questions began to echo louder than the answers. He pushed them away, telling himself he was being foolish. Maybe the previous owner had repurposed scrap metal to reinforce the driveway. Maybe it was nothing. But when he crouched down again, tilting his head to peer into the shadow of the opening, He saw how the soil seemed to sink deeper, as if it gave way into a hollow space. That sight twisted something inside him. A hollow beneath the driveway was not normal. He stood slowly, his gaze fixed on the cracked pavers. For a brief moment, his imagination carried him further than reason. He saw visions of sinkholes swallowing cars whole, of his house crumbling into a hidden cavity beneath the earth. He shook his head sharply to banish the thought, but it left a residue of unease that clung to him. The rest of the day unfolded in a haze. At the shop, while his coworkers joked and engines roared, his mind kept circling back to the driveway. He replayed the crunch of the paver, the sudden drop of the wheel, the glimpse of rusted metal. Every clang of a wrench and every hiss of compressed air seemed muted against the weight of his discovery. He tried to shake it off, telling himself he would deal with it later, but the questions gnawed at him like teeth in the dark. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the shadows stretched across the yard, Michael returned to the spot. The broken paver lay at an angle, the earth around it disturbed, the faint glint of metal still visible in the dim light. He crouched again, this time more deliberate, and pressed his hand against the soil. The ground crumbled easily, too easily. It wasn't the compacted, solid earth that should have been there. It was loose, as though someone had dug and then refilled it. The thought made his skin prickle. Curiosity warred with caution inside him. He knew enough about old houses to realize that uncovering something buried could mean trouble. Costly trouble. It could mean instability, repairs beyond his budget, or worse, legal entanglements if something dangerous was down there. But at the same time, he felt an undeniable pull. This was more than maintenance, more than simple repair. This was mystery, and mystery demanded an answer. He fetched a small trowel from the shed and began to dig. The soil gave way in clumps, damp and dark, and the metal surface grew clearer. It extended farther than he expected, wide and flat, its edges disappearing beneath the surrounding ground. He traced it with his hands, the roughness of rust scraping against his fingertips, until it became clear that this was not a pipe or debris. It was a structure, something man-made and deliberate. The longer he worked, the more the sense of unease grew. He felt as though the earth itself resisted him, as though each handful of dirt he removed was prying open a secret not meant for him. The garden around him grew still, the evening quiet deepening until he could hear only the sound of his own breath and the faint scrape of the trowel against soil. He paused often, lifting his head to listen, half expecting to hear that same muted noise from before, the sound of gravel against metal, though he knew it was impossible. When at last he leaned back, the sweat cooling on his brow, he saw enough to confirm what his instincts had already told him. The metal was not random. It was part of something hidden, something placed beneath the driveway with intent. The shape was rectangular, the edges too precise to be natural. His chest tightened as the possibilities swirled through his mind. He sat there for a long time, staring at the exposed surface as the light faded. The sun dipped below the trees, the sky bruised with the colors of twilight, and the shadows deepened around him. He could not deny it any longer. The cracks in the driveway, the sounds in the night, the collapse beneath his truck, they were not accidents. Something lay beneath his home, waiting to be found. As darkness crept in, Michael gathered his tools and stood, brushing the dirt from his hands. He told himself he would stop for now, that he would think it through with a clear head in the morning. Yet, even as he walked back toward the house, his eyes kept drifting to the broken pavers, to the dark hollow that seemed to breathe faintly beneath them. He could feel it pressing at the edges of his thoughts, a secret calling him deeper. That night, as he lay in bed, the sounds returned. Soft at first, almost indistinguishable from the hum of the night, then clearer, the scrape of something shifting below. He lay motionless, staring at the ceiling, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. He knew now that it was not the imagination of a weary man. The earth beneath his home was not empty. It was speaking to him, and it was only a matter of time before he would answer. The morning after the driveway gave way lingered in Michael's mind like a weight that refused to lift. He had slept little, drifting in and out of shallow rest, every sound outside jolting him awake. The scrape he had heard in the dark echoed in his thoughts, not with the faint mystery of before, but with the sharp insistence of something undeniable. Now he had seen the metal himself. Now there was no dismissing it as imagination or the quirks of an old property. He rose before dawn, poured himself a mug of coffee he barely tasted, and stepped outside into the damp chill of the early hour. The driveway lay before him, scarred and broken, a silent reminder of what waited below. He crouched beside the cracked paver, brushing at the loose dirt with his fingers, exposing more of the corroded surface he had uncovered the evening before. The light was weak, but enough to show him the outline of something larger. The object was not a pipe, not debris, but a flat plane of metal with edges buried deep into the earth. He felt the truth pressing closer as he cleared the soil, his heart beating with an anxious rhythm that matched the scrape of the trowel in his hand. The more he uncovered, the more obvious it became. This was no random fragment. It was a hatch. At first, the realization came quietly, like a whisper he tried to push aside. He leaned back, running a hand over his jaw, eyes fixed on the sharp line of the metal. It was rectangular, precise, the rusted edge meeting the soil at a perfect angle. He brushed more dirt away and revealed what looked like the outline of hinges on one side, half buried and stiff with years of corrosion. And then he saw it. A handle, almost invisible at first, curled and fused to the surface by time, but undeniably there. His breath caught in his throat. Michael sat back on the ground, staring at the hatch with disbelief. It had been hidden under the driveway for decades, sealed beneath layers of concrete and soil, waiting for this moment to emerge. A chill crept along his skin despite the steady climb of the morning sun. Who had built this? Why had it been buried? The questions pressed in, and none brought comfort. He rose to his feet and circled the opening slowly, as though studying an animal in the wild. The earth had clearly been tampered with long ago. The soil was loose, the hatch deliberately covered, and the concrete pavers above it had been laid without any indication of what lay beneath. It was deliberate concealment, not neglect. That thought made his chest tighten. He thought back to the seller's hurried eyes, the way the man's voice had trembled as he rushed him through the papers. Had he known about this? Had he chosen to bury it under layers of silence and cement, hoping it would never be found? Michael returned to his knees and placed his hands on the rusted handle. It was cold, rough under his fingers, as though it had been waiting for a lifetime to be touched again. He pulled. The hatch did not budge. He leaned his weight into it, straining until his muscles burned, but the rust and earth held it fast. It groaned faintly, a low creak that sent a shiver down his spine, but refused to open. The sound was not loud, but in the stillness of the morning, it felt deafening. He let go, chest heaving, and wiped sweat from his brow despite the cool air. He sat back, heart pounding, the silence around him thick and oppressive. For a moment, he questioned himself. Perhaps it was foolish to meddle with this. Perhaps the past had been sealed away for a reason. Yet, even as he tried to convince himself to stop, to leave it buried, his eyes kept returning to the outline of the hatch. It pulled at him with a weight stronger than reason. He had never believed in fate, but in that moment he felt as though he was meant to be here, meant to find this, meant to know what lay beneath. The rest of the day became a blur. He tried to distract himself with work, but every sound of metal on metal in the shop reminded him of the groan of the hatch. Every moment of silence brought him back to the image of the rusted handle. By the time he returned home, the sun already low, he knew he could not resist any longer. He gathered tools from the shed, crowbars, a hammer, anything that might give him leverage, and returned to the driveway with the determined steps of a man possessed. He drove the crowbar into the soil around the edges, prying loose the dirt that had held it captive for so long. Each motion released a puff of musty air, the scent of damp earth rising around him. Slowly, piece by piece, the edges became clearer, the rectangle of the hatch undeniable now. He wedged the crowbar under the handle and pressed with all his weight. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, with a crack that echoed in his chest, the hatch shifted. The sound was sharp and terrible, like the breaking of a seal that should never have been broken. He stumbled back instinctively, heart hammering, staring as the rusted metal lifted by a fraction of an inch. The air that escaped was cold and damp, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of stone and decay. Michael's stomach tightened as he stepped forward again, crouching to peer into the darkness below. The opening was narrow, the light unable to pierce the shadows that waited beyond. He leaned closer, straining to see, and then his eyes caught the faint outline of a ladder descending into the depths. The rungs were corroded, but the shape was clear. It was a passage, a way down into something deliberately hidden. He sat back on the ground, staring into the opening, the damp air clinging to his skin. His hands trembled slightly as he rubbed them together, trying to chase away the chill that had settled into him. He told himself he would not go down, not yet. It was dangerous, reckless even. The ladder looked weak, the air stale. He had no idea what kind of condition the space below was in, no idea what he might find. And yet, the thought of walking away felt impossible. He had already opened the door to the past, and the past was calling to him with a voice that would not be silenced. That night, as he lay in bed, he could not close his eyes without seeing the hatch. Every time he shifted under the covers, he imagined the ladder descending into the earth, the shadows waiting at the bottom. He imagined the air pressing heavy against his lungs, the silence so complete it swallowed every sound. And beneath it all, he thought he could hear the scrape again, faint but clear, as though the earth itself was shifting in anticipation of what he would do next. The house seemed to hold its breath around him, waiting. Michael knew then that he had crossed a threshold. The driveway was no longer just a cracked surface leading to his home. It was an entryway into something older, something hidden, something meant to be forgotten. But it was no longer forgotten. Not anymore. He had uncovered the secret, and though he had not yet descended, he knew with absolute certainty that he would. The decision was no longer his to make. The hatch had been opened, and with it, the silence of his new home had been broken forever. Michael awoke the next morning with the hatch still heavy in his thoughts. It wasn't a dream, though for a moment after he opened his eyes he almost wished it had been. The image of that rusted handle, the groan of metal as he forced it open, and the breath of cold air rising from below all returned to him in an instant. He lay still in bed, staring at the ceiling, the silence of the house pressing down like a weight. The quiet was no longer peaceful, no longer the balm he had sought when leaving the city. Now it felt watchful, like the house itself was waiting for him to act. When he finally rose, he moved through his morning routine on autopilot. Coffee brewed, bread toasted, a glance at the paper he didn't read. All the while, his thoughts kept circling back to the hatch. It was there, under the broken pavers, its presence undeniable. He could no more ignore it than he could ignore the thud of his own heartbeat. He finished his coffee in silence, set the mug aside, and knew he would not be able to last the day without returning to it. The morning air was cool as he stepped outside, the grass damp with dew. The driveway lay before him, scarred and broken, the soil around the hatch disturbed from the previous day's effort. He approached slowly, the sight of it filling him with a strange mix of dread and inevitability. The handle jutted from the earth like a relic of another age, rust clinging to its surface, its hinges stiff and unnatural against the soil. He crouched, his hand hovering above the opening, and for a long moment he considered leaving it closed, sealing it again as though it had never been discovered. But he knew that was impossible. The secret had been uncovered. Whatever lay below was part of his house now, part of his life. He fetched supplies from the shed, a heavy-duty flashlight, a length of rope, a small toolkit, and a dust mask. He wasn't sure what condition the air would be in down there, and the thought of breathing stale, trapped air from decades past made his chest tighten. He tied the rope securely to a post nearby, looped it around his waist for safety, and tested the knots with the steady hands of someone used to practical work. Only when everything was ready did he turn back to the hatch. With a grunt, he pulled the handle again, forcing the hatch open wider than before. It resisted, the hinges groaning loudly, but at last it yielded, swinging back with a screech that echoed across the yard. A draft of air rose from below, cool and damp, carrying the scent of earth and rust. Michael leaned over the opening, his flashlight beam piercing the shadows. The light revealed the top of the ladder, its rungs corroded but intact, descending into darkness. The walls were lined with brick, slick with moisture, and the space below seemed to stretch farther than he expected. His heart pounded as he lowered himself onto the ladder. The first rung groaned under his weight, and for an instant he thought it might give way, but it held. He descended cautiously, one hand gripping the side rail, the other clutching the flashlight. The beam wavered across damp brick and rusted metal, illuminating details that made his skin prickle. Cobwebs clung to the corners, the brickwork old but solid, and the air grew colder with each step. The ladder extended deeper than he had imagined. It was as though he were climbing out of the world he knew and into another entirely. The light from above shrank until it was only a pale glow at the mouth of the hatch. The silence was absolute, broken only by the creak of metal and the sound of his own breathing through the mask. He paused halfway down, his body tense, and shone the beam below. The light revealed a floor, earthen and uneven, and the outline of a small chamber. When his boots touched the ground, he stood still, the air heavy around him. The space was larger than he had expected, a rectangular room reinforced with brick and concrete. The walls curved slightly inward, giving the impression of being swallowed by the earth itself. He swept the flashlight slowly across the chamber, his breath catching at what he saw. Old newspapers lay crumpled in a corner, their pages yellowed and brittle. Rusted tin cans were stacked along one wall, some collapsed into themselves, others still intact but corroded. Glass bottles lay shattered across the floor, their surfaces dulled by time. And on the far wall, drawn in uneven strokes of black, were markings. He stepped closer, lifting the light. They were words, scrawled in charcoal or soot, faded and smudged, but still legible in places. Wait. Night. Fear. The words repeated, some crossed out, others circled as if written in desperation. The sight made his skin crawl. These weren't the careless scribbles of vandals or children. They were messages, fragments of thoughts left behind by those who had once huddled here. He could almost imagine the dim flicker of a lantern, the whispers of frightened voices, the sound of footsteps pacing in the darkness. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to steady himself, and when he opened them again, the markings seemed even more haunting. He explored further, careful with each step, the earth soft under his boots. The chamber had clearly been used as a shelter. The walls were reinforced with mortar, the ceiling low but sturdy, the entire space designed to withstand weight above. He found what looked like the remains of bedding, scraps of fabric, rotted and frayed, piled in a corner. There were empty jars, rusted lids, and the faint impression of crates that had long since decayed into dust. The silence pressed in heavier now, as if the chamber itself carried the memory of those who had once lived in it. He tried to imagine what it must have been like to hide down here, the sounds of war or disaster above, the air thick with fear and uncertainty. For the first time since discovering the hatch, he felt not just curiosity but sorrow, a grief for people he had never met but who had left their mark in these walls. As he continued to search, his flashlight beam caught on something else, a small metal box half buried in the soil near the corner. He crouched and dug it free, brushing away dirt. The box was rusted, its hinges stiff, but when he forced it open, he found remnants inside. Papers, too brittle to unfold without crumbling, and a piece of fabric that looked like a child's handkerchief embroidered with the faint outline of initials. He held it gently in his hands, the weight of it almost too much to bear. Whoever had left it here had done so in haste, perhaps never to return. The thought sent a chill through him. He rose slowly, his gaze sweeping once more across the chamber, and for the first time he felt the space watching him back. It was not empty. It was filled with echoes, with voices carried forward through the silence. He could not hear them, not in any physical way, but he felt them all the same. Michael tightened his grip on the flashlight and turned toward the ladder. He had seen enough for now, more than enough to know that this was no ordinary cellar or forgotten construction. This was a place of refuge, of desperation, of survival. And it had been hidden deliberately, sealed away as though the world above had wanted to forget it. When he emerged back into the daylight, the sun was high, the air warm on his skin. He blinked against the brightness, the world above feeling strangely unreal after the heavy silence below. He closed the hatch carefully, his hands trembling, and sat on the edge of the driveway, staring at the disturbed earth. He knew now that his home was not what he had believed. Beneath the cracked pavers and weathered walls lay a story, one that had waited decades to be uncovered. And he also knew, with a certainty that made his chest tighten, that he was not finished. The chamber was only the beginning. Something larger lingered down there, something that demanded to be understood. The secret had revealed itself, and Michael could not turn away. The discovery of the underground chamber left Michael restless. Even after climbing out into the warmth of the afternoon sun, he carried the cold of that place inside him. It was as though the silence below had lodged itself in his bones. He moved through the rest of the day in a haze, cleaning his hands of dirt that seemed unwilling to leave, his mind replaying the scrawled words on the wall and the fragile handkerchief embroidered with initials. It was not only the fact that something had been hidden beneath his driveway that unsettled him, but the humanity of it. The evidence that people had once lived in that space, frightened and waiting. He could not shake the feeling that he had stepped into a chapter of history that had been buried deliberately, a chapter that carried the voices of people like him. That night, he barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the words again. Wait. Night. Fear. He imagined the dim glow of lantern light, the sound of whispered prayers, the quiet cries of children muffled against their mothers' shoulders. His own breathing echoed too loudly in his ears as he lay awake, listening to the stillness of the house. The silence was different now. It wasn't just the absence of noise. It was filled with weight, with a story pressing to be told. By morning, he knew he could not ignore it. He needed answers. The chamber was too deliberate to be chance, too human to be mere construction. It was not enough to know that it existed. He had to know who had built it, why it had been hidden, and what had happened to the people who had once sought safety there. The questions gnawed at him sharper with each passing hour, until he felt he could not breathe without searching for the truth. He began with the most obvious place, the local library. It was a squat brick building that smelled of old paper and dust, a place he had rarely visited since his school days. Yet, when he walked inside, clutching his notebook as though it were a lifeline, he felt a strange sense of belonging. Rows of history books stretched before him, the weight of countless stories waiting to be uncovered. He approached the desk, asked about archives, and was led to a quiet corner where records of the town's past were kept. The hours slipped away as he leafed through brittle documents and faded photographs. He searched for mentions of shelters, of underground structures, of the war years. The town had indeed seen its share of fear during World War II. He read of bombings near the industrial district, of ration lines stretching down the streets, of citizens urged to take precautions. There were mentions of Anderson shelters, the cheap steel structures distributed widely in those years. But the chamber he had found was no Anderson shelter. It was larger, sturdier, built with brick and concrete rather than sheet metal. It was something different, something communal. What unsettled him most was the silence surrounding certain groups of people. There were articles that praised the resilience of the town, the bravery of its citizens, but little mention of the black workers who had been brought in to help build the factories and repair roads. Michael knew enough of history to recognize omission when he saw it. The archives painted a picture of unity and strength, but the voices of people who looked like him were absent, erased by selective memory. He leaned closer to the documents, eyes scanning for any small clue, and finally he found a brief mention in a yellowed newspaper clipping from 1942. It spoke of a temporary settlement on the edge of town, where laborers from other regions had been housed. The article was brief, almost dismissive, but it was enough. He knew now that there had been black families here during those years, living on the margins, their presence acknowledged only in passing lines that stripped them of humanity. Michael felt a surge of anger mixed with sorrow as he copied the words into his notebook. These families had existed. They had lived, worked, suffered, and feared just like anyone else. and when the bombs threatened, they had needed shelter. But where had they gone when the official shelters were reserved for others? The answer seemed to echo back at him from the memory of that chamber beneath his driveway. They had built their own refuge, hidden and forgotten by history. Determined to learn more, Michael sought out the town records office. He pored over maps of property lines, tracing the evolution of the land where his house now stood. Before the home was built in the 1970s, the plot had been empty, adjacent to what had once been that temporary settlement. The pieces began to align in his mind. The families had built a shelter nearby, perhaps on communal ground, a place where they could gather when the sirens wailed. Later, when the war ended and the settlement faded, the shelter remained, buried under time and silence until a house was constructed above it. The thought made his skin prickle. His own home stood atop a story that had been erased. As the days passed, Michael grew consumed by the search. He spoke with elderly residents, knocking on doors with the politeness of a man who knew he might not be welcome. Most offered little, some shaking their heads as though the past was too far gone to recall. But one older woman, her hair silver and her eyes sharp despite her years, leaned on her cane and told him what she remembered. Yes, she said, there had been families who worked hard and lived quietly at the edge of town. She recalled children playing barefoot in the dirt, women washing clothes in shared tubs, men returning weary from the factories. She remembered, too, that they had not been welcome in the same shelters as others. Her voice softened as she admitted that she did not know where they had gone when the sirens sounded, only that they disappeared from sight until the danger passed. Michael thanked her, though his heart ached. He returned home that evening with her words echoing in his mind. They disappeared from sight. The phrase fit too perfectly with what he had seen beneath his driveway. These families had disappeared into the earth, into the chamber he had uncovered, hiding their fear and resilience in the silence of brick and stone. The more he uncovered, the more he felt a connection that went beyond curiosity. This was not just history. It was his history, his heritage, tied to people who had shared his skin, his struggle, his determination to endure. He imagined them digging with bare hands, stacking bricks, reinforcing walls, building a sanctuary for their children because no one else would. The thought filled him with both pride and sorrow, a deep recognition of the strength it had taken to carve out survival in a world that denied them dignity. Late one night, sitting at his kitchen table with papers spread before him, Michael felt the weight of it all settle into him. The chamber was more than an oddity. It was a monument to forgotten lives, a place that had been deliberately hidden beneath layers of earth and silence. The previous owner of the house must have known. Perhaps he had chosen to bury it, to erase what he considered an inconvenience. But now the earth had given way, and the truth had risen into the light once more. Michael closed his notebook and pressed his hands together, his gaze drifting toward the darkened window. Beyond it lay the driveway, the hatch sealed once again, but no longer silent. He knew he could not stop here. He had uncovered enough to see the outlines of the story, but the full truth still waited in the shadows below. The chamber was not finished speaking. It had more to show him, more to tell, if only he had the courage to keep digging, and Michael knew he would. The search for truth had become more than curiosity. It had become a responsibility, a duty to the voices etched into the walls with words of fear and hope. They had waited long enough. Now, through him, their story would rise again. Michael could no longer pass the driveway without feeling the tug of what lay beneath. It was no longer just an underground chamber, no longer just an architectural curiosity buried in the soil. It had become alive in his imagination, pulsing with the echo of lives once hidden there. Each time he walked over the cracked pavers, he thought of the families who must have gathered in fear below, listening to the rumble of planes and the shriek of sirens above them. He thought of children clutching their mothers, of men crouched in silence, waiting for the night to pass. The house had ceased to feel entirely his own. It was theirs as well, a place layered with lives that had preceded him. He knew he had to return. The research he had done, the fragments of history he had unearthed, had only deepened his sense that there was more to be found. The chamber was not a single room of survival. It was a fragment of something larger. The words on the walls, the relics of food and fabric, spoke of a space used often, a place of refuge that must have been prepared with care. Michael was certain there was more, that another room, another story, still lay hidden beneath the earth. One evening, as the sun sank and painted the sky in muted gold, Michael gathered his tools once more. He secured the rope, opened the hatch, and descended the ladder with the steadiness of a man returning, not to mystery, but to a responsibility he had accepted. The air was as heavy as before, the chill clinging to his skin, but this time he did not hesitate. His flashlight swept across the familiar chamber, illuminating the crumbling newspapers and the scrawled words on the wall. But his attention fixed quickly on the corner where the bricks looked uneven, as though someone had once sealed off a passage. He approached slowly, shining the beam along the rough masonry. It was different from the rest of the walls. The bricks were stacked hurriedly, the mortar uneven, and behind them he thought he could hear the faint hollowness of space. His heart quickened. He set down the flashlight, picked up his hammer and chisel, and began to chip away at the old mortar. The sound echoed sharply in the confined space, each strike bouncing off the walls like thunder. Dust rose in clouds, coating his mask, clinging to his clothes. The air grew thick, and yet he pressed on, each blow carrying with it the sense that he was not destroying, but uncovering, not breaking, but releasing. At last, one brick loosened, tumbling forward with a dull thud onto the earth. Michael crouched and peered through the gap. His flashlight beam slipped into the darkness beyond and revealed more brick walls, more space. His breath caught. He widened the opening carefully, removing brick after brick until the hole was large enough to crawl through. He hesitated only a moment, then slid forward on his stomach, the beam of light cutting into the shadows ahead. He emerged into a second chamber, larger than the first, the air damp and still. His flashlight swept across the room, and what it revealed made him pause in silence. There were objects here, scattered and half-buried, untouched for decades. A small wooden doll lay on its side, its paint faded but still faintly visible. A tin soldier stood crooked near the wall, its once bright colors dulled by time. In another corner lay a necklace, its chain tangled, its pendant still catching the faint glint of light. These were not supplies or scraps. These were personal things, fragments of lives left behind in haste. Michael knelt and picked up the doll carefully, brushing the dust from its surface. He imagined a child clutching it tight, whispering comfort to themselves in the darkness. He set it back gently and moved to the necklace, lifting it with reverence. It was delicate, the kind of keepsake someone might wear daily, a token of memory and love. He turned it in his hand, and for a moment he felt the weight of its story pressing into him. This was no longer just a shelter. It was a home for people in their most vulnerable moments, a place where they had brought their children, their treasures, their hopes. As he explored further, his light caught on something near the wall, a book, its cover warped and edges crumbling. He picked it up carefully, heart pounding, and brushed the dust away. It was a diary, the pages fragile but intact enough to reveal faded ink. He turned to the first page, his hands trembling, and began to read. The handwriting was uneven, hurried but legible. The first entry spoke of sirens, of the rush to gather belongings and descend into the earth. Later entries described nights filled with fear, the sound of bombs echoing in the distance, the prayers whispered in darkness. There were mentions of children crying, of food shared sparingly, of long hours spent waiting for silence above. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that struck Michael to his core. He could hear the voices in them, could feel the lives pressing through the ink. One entry made him pause. It spoke of exclusion, of being told that the official shelters were not for them, that they must make do elsewhere. It described the bitterness of building their own refuge, of hiding not only from the bombs but from the judgment of those above. Michael's throat tightened as he read. It was confirmation of what he had suspected, proof written in the hand of someone who had lived through it. This was the story of people pushed to the margins, yet refusing to be broken. He read for hours, the light of his flashlight trembling as the battery weakened, until the words blurred through the moisture in his eyes. He set the diary down gently, his chest heavy with grief and pride. He had found not only evidence but voices that spoke across time, demanding to be heard. When at last he climbed back up the ladder into the night air, the stars spread wide above him, he felt changed. The weight of history pressed on his shoulders not as a burden, but as a calling. He could not let this be forgotten. The doll, the necklace, the diary, all of it had to be preserved, shared, remembered. The people who had hidden here deserved more than silence. They deserved recognition, dignity, remembrance. Michael stood for a long time in the driveway, staring at the hatch that led down into their world. The night was quiet, but it was no longer an empty quiet. It was filled with voices, with echoes of laughter, fear, love, and resilience. He could hear them now, not with his ears but with his heart, and he knew he would carry them forward. The past had spoken to him, and he would not let it fade again. Michael stood in the darkness of his yard. The hatch closed once more at his feet, but he felt as though he had left part of himself down below with the diary and the doll and the necklace. The voices he had heard in the written words and imagined in the silence of those chambers clung to him, and he could not shake them even as he turned to walk back into the house. The night sky stretched wide above him, the stars glimmering faintly, but his eyes kept returning to the ground, to the secret world beneath his driveway. It no longer belonged only to the past. It belonged to him now, too. The responsibility of it weighed on him more heavily than he had ever expected. In the days that followed, he tried to carry on with his normal life, waking for work, turning wrenches in the shop, chatting with his co-workers, but everything felt different. Every sound of machinery, every flash of metal reminded him of the groan of that hatch opening for the first time. Every pause in conversation carried the echo of the diary entries he had read, of the families huddled underground while the world above them denied their existence. When people asked casually how the new house was, he found himself hesitating, unsure how to answer. How could he explain that his home was built upon a forgotten sanctuary of survival, upon stories erased from the town's memory? The more he thought about it, the more certain he became that silence was no longer an option. The chambers beneath his driveway were not his secret to keep. They were history, and history did not belong buried. He felt anger at the thought of the previous owner who must have known and chosen to cover it all, perhaps out of shame, perhaps out of indifference. But he felt something deeper than anger now. He felt obligation. Those voices had trusted him by surviving long enough to be found. He would not betray them. At first, he tried to explain it to his neighbors, the ones who nodded politely when they saw him in the yard. He spoke of the chamber, of the evidence of families who had hidden there, of the diary that confirmed their exclusion from the official shelters. Some listened with polite curiosity, others with discomfort, and a few with skepticism. One man shook his head and muttered that it was best to leave the past in the past, that digging it up would only cause trouble. Another neighbor frowned and asked if he really wanted to bring attention to such things, as though memory itself were dangerous. Michael listened but did not yield. He knew what he had found. Their reluctance only strengthened his resolve. He reached out to the local historical society next. They sent a representative, a woman with glasses perched on the end of her nose and a notebook clutched in her hand. She stepped carefully across his driveway as he showed her the hatch, her eyes narrowing with interest as he described what he had seen. When he led her down into the chamber, shining his flashlight on the words scrawled across the wall and the artifacts he had carefully set aside, her breath caught audibly. She admitted she had never known of such a place in town, never heard stories of it, but the evidence was undeniable. She promised to bring others to document it properly, to see what could be done to preserve it. But Michael did not want it to be handled coldly, reduced to records and files in a forgotten archive. He wanted it alive, visible, accessible. He wanted children to be able to stand where he had stood and feel what he had felt, the weight of fear and hope pressed into those walls. He wanted people to read the words from the diary, to hold the doll in their hands, to understand that history was not distant, but immediate, rooted in the very soil beneath their feet. He spent his evenings cleaning and clearing the chambers with care, hauling out rubble and dirt, reinforcing the latter, making the spaces safe enough for others to enter. Each shovelful of soil he carried up felt like an offering, a way of bringing the forgotten back into the light. He set the diary in a protective case, arranged the objects he had found on a sturdy table, and treated them not as curiosities, but as sacred remnants of lives lived in shadows. The more he worked, the more the chambers transformed from hidden refuge to memorial. News of his discovery began to spread beyond the neighborhood. A reporter from the local paper came, snapping photographs as Michael guided her below. The story ran on the front page a week later with a headline about a hidden shelter beneath suburban home. Soon after, television crews appeared, their cameras capturing the rusted hatch, the narrow ladder, the damp brick walls that had once cradled frightened families. Neighbors who had been dismissive at first returned. Their expressions changed, their voices softer as they asked questions. Some apologized for doubting him. Others simply stood in silence, staring at the scrawled words on the walls, as though finally hearing the echoes that had haunted Michael for weeks. Through it all, Michael remained steady. He did not care for the attention, the flash of cameras, or the bustle of reporters. What mattered to him were the voices, the people who had hidden in those chambers, the story that was finally being told. He spoke to anyone who would listen about the families who had built their own refuge when the world denied them safety, about the resilience it took to carve sanctuary from earth and brick, about the injustice of their erasure from history. He spoke with pride, not just sorrow, because to him they were not only victims of exclusion, but heroes of survival. There were still those who resisted. Some town officials frowned at the prospect of designating the site as historical, citing costs and concerns about safety. A few even suggested sealing it again, arguing that too much attention to such stories might stir division. But Michael refused to bend. He wrote letters, attended meetings, spoke firmly and clearly about why the shelter mattered. He reminded them that history was not always comfortable, that remembering was not meant to be easy but necessary. His words carried weight, not because he was loud, but because he spoke with the conviction of someone who had walked the path of silence and chosen to break it. One afternoon, as he stood in the chamber with a group of school children on a guided visit, he watched their eyes widen at the sight of the markings on the wall, at the doll resting in a glass case, at the diary open to a page describing a night of bombs. He listened as their teacher explained the war, the exclusion, the resilience of the people who had hidden here. And in that moment, Michael felt a swell of something he had not known in years: hope. The voices of the past were speaking again, carried forward in the minds of the young, refusing to be forgotten. When the designation finally came, when the shelter was officially recognized as a site of historical significance, Michael stood quietly outside his home, looking down at the hatch. It no longer felt like a secret burden. It was a doorway, not into darkness, but into memory. He touched the rusted handle with reverence, his heart steady. He thought of the diary's final entries, of the child's toy, of the necklace that had once hung around a mother's neck. He thought of the fear and the resilience, the silence and the survival. The house was his, but the story belonged to everyone. He had not sought it, but it had found him, and he had done what he could to honor it. The voices that had once been confined to whispers in the dark were free now, carried forward by every visitor who stepped down the ladder into the chambers. They would not fade again. As the sun set that evening, Michael remained by the hatch, listening to the quiet. It was no longer an empty silence. It was filled with presence, with echoes, with memory. He closed his eyes and let it wash over him, a chorus of voices that no longer waited in fear, but stood proudly in the light of remembrance. And he knew, with a certainty that filled him with peace, that he had fulfilled his role as their keeper. The story was no longer buried. It lived, and it would endure. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next unbelievable story. Click here to watch more jaw-dropping videos that will leave you speechless. And if this story amazed you, share it with your friends and family. You never know who else will be shocked by what's been uncovered.